There are many ways to do a provisional cast on, but the result is always the same. The cast on edge is not really an edge. It's a set of open stitches that we can pick up later on. Many ways of making this cast on involve a crochet hook, but not all knitters have one and many don't like to use it. So in this tutorial, I'll show you 3 ways to make a provisional cast on using just yarn and knitting needles. To do a provisional cast on using the first way, we would need a piece of a scrap yarn that is a bit longer than the expected length of the cast on edge. So take your working yarn and leave a small tail, doesn't really matter how big the tail is, and make a slip knot. Now place that slip knot on the needle and hold the needle in your right hand. Now take the scrap yarn and place it behind the working yarn and underneath the needle like this, and then hold the yarn tail so it doesn't get in the way, and the scrap yarn and the needle all in your right hand, just like this. So we have just 2 strands here, the scrap yarn at the back of the working yarn that is at the front. Now take the working yarns. I'm gonna hold the scrap yarn so that it doesn't, it doesn't get shaky. And then take the working yarn and place it at the back of the scrap yarn and at the front of the needle. So that's our first move. Now move the working yarn over the needle to the back of the needle and to the front of the scrap yarn. See, I'm holding this wrap so I don't lose it because it's really tricky to do it using just one hand. So hold that loop and then bring the working yarn to the front of the scrap yarn again. So we are basically back to square one, right? So we've just cast on 1 stitch and we are back to where we started. The scrap yarn is at the back and the working yarn is at the front. And let's do it again. So that's basically how it works. So take the working yarn, bring it to the back of the scrap yarn and to the front of the needle. Then over the needle to the back of the needle, hold that wrap so you don't lose it, and bring the working yarn to the front of the scrap yarn. If you look at it like this way, then it will resemble a digit 8. That's what we are doing. We are basically wrapping it, but not just plain wrap, but a tricky one. So let's do it once again. Back of the scrap yarn, front of the needle, back of the needle, front of the scrap yarn. And then keep doing that until you have as many stitches as you need, and all your stitches will be safely sitting on the piece of scrap yarn. So I'm going to cast on a few more stitches. And then when you are done with as many stitches as you need, turn your work. Make sure that you don't untwist the yarns over here. You might even want to hold them like this. And then start knitting or working in the pattern. So I'm going to grab another needle. And here we go. And that's it. So your stitches are sitting on a piece of scrap yarn. And once you finish the first row, you can do it right away, but I usually work 1 row to make sure the stitches are not unraveling. And then once you finish the first row, you can basically pull the scrap yarn a bit to rearrange it somehow, and then make little bows or slip knots or something to keep the yarn, to keep the stitches on the yarn, so the stitches won't slip off the yarn. I'm gonna do another one. And that's it. And then you continue knitting and or working in the pattern. And when you need these stitches, you're gonna simply pick them up. I'm gonna work a few rows in plain stockinette stitch, and then I'll show you how to pick up stitches from the scrap yarn. Okay, now I have a tiny little swatch over here, and let's assume that it's time for us to to get back to these stitches that are sitting on the scrap yarn right now. So here's how you transfer them on the needle. Simply undo one of the bows over here and then pull the scrap yarn a bit. It's better to do it on a flat surface so you know, and you're not kind of on the road, so you know you are not gonna lose any stitches. What's gonna happen, even if you even if they slip off the scrap yarn, they won't unravel, so they will be still there, but it will be hard to pick them up for work later on. So it's not really a major issue, but an inconvenience for sure. So insert the needle into the stitch and take the scrap yarn out. Insert the needle into the stitch and take the scrap yarn out, or you can just insert the needle in all of the stitches or a few stitches and then just pull on the yarn. So it's totally up to you. Basically, it's not really a complicated task to transfer the stitches from the scrap yarn to the working needle. The last one is gonna be a bit different because see, it's all kind of, it's really tiny and it's twisted. Keep it that way, because if it's not twisted, it's gonna get you're gonna get a hole in there. So just the last one is gonna be different. Otherwise, it's not really complicated at all. And as you see, your stitches are back on the needle, and now you can work them any way you like, and the fabric will look seamless, because basically it is. The second way of making a provisional cast on without a crochet hook is very similar to the first one in a way that the stitches will be sitting on a scrap yarn, and the piece of the scrap yarn should be a bit bigger than the length of the estimated cast on edge. That's it. So take your working yarn, make a slip knot. That's another similarity between these two ways, and place it on the right needle like this. Then hold the needle, the yarn, the working yarn, and the yarn tail, of course, and the scrap yarn all in your right hand, just like we did before. But this time it doesn't really matter where the yarn is, whether the scrap yarn is, whether it's behind or not. I just leave it as it is. Now insert your left index finger and your left thumb between these strands so that the working yarn is sitting on your left index finger and the scrap yarn is on your thumb, like this. And then hold both strands with the rest of your left fingers, exactly like we do when we do long tail cast on. See, so I'm just holding them. Now here's what we do. Move the needle underneath the scrap yarn like this, and pick the working yarn from right to left like this. Now move it back from underneath the scrap yarn, and here's your first stitch. Now move the needle again, but this time we simply pick the yarn from the working yarn from right to left like this. And that's it. Now 2 stitches done, and we simply repeat. Go underneath the scrap yarn, pick the working yarn, move it out, and then simply pick the yarn. And once again, 1 stitch, another stitch, 1 stitch, another stitch, and that's how you cast on stitches. The result is the same. The stitches are sitting on this scrap yarn, and when you are done casting on and work the first row, then make bows at the ends of the scrap yarn, and when it's time to pick the stitches from the scrap yarn, you do it in exactly the same manner as we did when we discussed the way number 1. The third way we're going to discuss in this tutorial is a bit different from the previous 2. We would also need a piece of scrap yarn, you see it's right here, but for this way we need a long one, because this type of cast on is based on the long tail cast on, and it's even called a long tail provisional cast on. That's what it is. The tail should be, the piece of scrap yarn should be about at least 3 times longer than the estimated length of the cast on edge, and the scrap yarn will basically replace the tail in the usual version, the regular version of the long tail cast on. Here's how it works. Align the working yarn and the scrap yarn and hold both strands and the needle in your right hand like this. Then insert your left index finger and your thumb in between strands so that the working yarn is sitting on the left index finger and the scrap yarn is on your thumb, and hold both strands with the rest of your the remaining 3 fingers. And that's the setup. And now we simply do the long tail cast on. So you go into the thumb loop and then pick the yarn that comes from the index finger, that is the working yarn, and then make a stitch, and then do it again and again and again until you have as many stitches as you need. And because these stitches are safely sitting on that scrap yarn, unlike the first 2 ways, the scrap yarn is actually wrapped around each stitch. See, that's how it looks. So because of that, it is much safer. So the stitches, there is very little chance that the stitches get unraveled, and you don't even need to secure the ends of the scrap yarn. You can simply trim them after you cast on as many stitches as you need and keep them hanging there, and that's it. And then you turn your work when you are done with the casting on. Turn your work and work in the pattern. But the challenging part for this cast on would be to retrieve the stitches. I'm gonna work a few rows, so I have a bit of a swatch here, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so now I have some fabric, so we could kind of pretend that it's time, right? And we want to retrieve these stitches, so we want to get them back on the needle. Start from the tail, and then start undoing this scrap yarn. Feel free to trim it a bit more. Like, actually, I'm gonna do just that. Make it really short so it's easier to undo it, and then make like 2 moves to undo the yarn. And then when you get to this point that the stitch is only sitting on a strand of scrap yarn, pick the stitch from back to front and then continue undoing. So 1, and then the second move, 2, and then see the stitch is sitting on just a piece of scrap yarn, and I pick it from back to front and then continue undo the yarn. If you don't feel comfortable doing that with your fingers, use a wool needle. That's usually easier. So pick a stitch. If you have a lot of stitches, then trim the scrap yarn every once in a while so it's easier. Like, for example, I'm gonna do it right now. I'm gonna trim it again so it's easier to take it out of the work. So 1, 2, and then pick a stitch. 1, 2, and pick that stitch. It takes a bit longer than the picking up stitches when we use the previous 2 ways, but the stitches are safer on the needles and on the scrap yarn, definitely with this way. So it's up to you. I mean, all these ways are good, just depends on what you like better. Okay, so I'm gonna pick this stitch, and then, because I'm not sure which end of the scrap yarn it's coming from, and the last stitch is gonna be a bit weird, so we're gonna pick it as it is. It's gonna look unusual, but it's a totally valid stitch. You can use it, and the number of stitches that you get when you pick up stitches this way is exactly the same as the number of stitches that we cast on. And this was the 3rd way of doing a provisional cast on without a crochet hook. So now you know 3 ways how to make a provisional cast on without a crochet hook. It doesn't really matter which way you decide to use, because this cast on is meant to be unraveled. So don't pay attention at the way it looks. When the project is finished and the open stitches are incorporated into the work, the cast on itself will not affect the look of the finished project in any way. If you'd like to know what the next tutorial is all about, sign up for the updates on my Patreon page. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching this video and have a wonderful week. I'll see you next Thursday.